Hey everyone, today we're going to be taking a look at the G.I. Joe Classified series Tele-Viper with his Cobra flight pod, or also known as the Trubble Bubble. Shout out to my friendly neighborhood collector store Robo for bringing this early. And as usual, please like, share, comment, subscribe, or even hit that super thanks button. I do appreciate all engagement on my channel. So here we have a quick look at the box. It's pretty long, about 12 inches. I do like the front picture quite a bit. We have the TeleViper riding his Trubble Bubble, and he's launching off along with the rest of his platoon. Purple colorway for the artwork over here is also really cool, and a whole bunch of accessories are also included on the top right. When we have at the top of the box, we have the G.I. Joe logo, and as you can see, the box is also pretty thick. And we go down to the bottom, some product information at the bottom together with the UPC. On the side, he's labeled number 79, and there's a QR code over here. On the back of the box, render of the figure, the whole bunch of accessories, the Trubble Bubble, as well as a skill chart. And you also get a zoom in on a couple of interesting details, both on the figure as well as the Trubble Bubble. And finally, onto that last side, it's a larger version of that same artwork that we saw on the front. So now, let's go ahead and get this one open. So on the inside of the box, there's a cardboard insert holding the figure as well as the whole Trubble Bubble. In the backdrop, it's the artwork of the Tele-Viper in just black and white. It's a nice touch that Hasbro has also included another cardboard insert over here to keep the Trubble Bubble in place. However, there does seem to be a lot of wasted space inside this box, and that's gonna certainly add to the cost of shipping. And not forgetting the accessory box, which is also pretty big. Also labeled 79 with a Cobra logo, and it's got that deco of an ammo box printed on it. Inside this box we have an accessory bag that, once again, there's a lot of wasted space in this packaging. In the first bag, we have a couple of accessories. Here are some adapters to mount the rocket to the Trubble Bubble, the TeleViper's backpack. We have the bomb, 2 rockets, a tube and a weapon for the TeleViper, 2 alternate helmeted hits, and a large cannon that attaches to the Trubble Bubble. And in the last bag, we do have the couple of thrusters that would attach to the Trubble Bubble. First up, we're having a look at the aerial mine. It's sculpted with a smooth spherical sculpt on top with a couple of ports for pressure sensors, and then the rounded sculpt leads to the bottom where it's got a couple of vents, red paint for a couple of indicators, leading up to the access panel over here, which you can certainly pop open, revealing a little bit of circuitry on the inside that's painted in gray. At the bottom on the vents, this is also colored a metallic gunmetal paint, and there's also a small hole at the bottom for you to port some effects in. Over here I'm using an effect part from the Viper 3 pack, and it pops on just fine, so it looks like it's blasting off to its final location to ambush some Joes. Next up, we're looking at the huge cannon that goes to the bottom of the flight pod. This is cast in a black plastic, and there's details like a couple of cables down the back, some vents over here. We also see that same sort of detail on the other side, and on top we see this hole which plugs into that ball joint on the bottom of the flight pod like so. Next up, we have the thrusters for the back of the flight pod. The housing is cast in a light gray plastic, painted details like the danger indicator over here for the hot exhaust, some mechanical detail over here, and there are some sculpted panels and rivets down the middle. There's a separate black plastic top of the thrusters, and on either side of these 2 big thrusters, we have the unit number and the Cobra insignia, which is fairly neatly painted on, especially when it's done over these sculpted rivets on the sides. To the bottom of these thrusters, and we have a gunmetal paint over here. There are also separate plastic pieces attached over here, and these swing out side to side with an interesting plastic linkage on the middle that ensures these 2 will steer in tandem, and that's how you control the direction that the flight pod hovers. Finally, there are these 2 pegs over here that would go into those 2 holes on the back of the flight pod, pegging in quite snugly like so. We also have 2 black plastic adapters for the rockets. On the insides of these 2 adapters, you can see that they're sculpted with R1 and L2. but in actual fact, because of the way that these are sculpted, keyed into the sides of the flight pod. Over here I have the R1 piece that actually goes into the left side of the flight pod, like so. So that can be a little confusing, but just look out for the way that the adapters are sculpted, keyed into that sculpt on the side of the flight pod. And the last accessories for the flight pods are these two rockets sculpted in black plastic, and each rocket also comes with two sets of stabilizing fins. Looking for the hole on the side, and this will peg into those adapters really snugly, going onto each side of the flight pod. And now taking a look at the flight pod, and we see the same sort of detail and sharp paint applications just like on the two thrusters. We have some exposed electronic detail over here, dark gray, black and red paint, couple of temples down the sides like you can see over here pointing to the fuse area with a caution message. The panel detailing is pretty sharp, and you can clearly see all the rivets in their places holding the panels. It seems like the bottom part of the flight pod is assembled from a separate piece of flat black plastic with a light gray paint over a couple of panels on the front and back, and this light gray paint matches to the light gray plastic on most of the flight pod housing. The bottom of the flight pod is also nicely detailed with of course the two big fins and two smaller sort of turbines down the side over here that possibly give it the forward and backward speed that it needs. Also an outlet over here, and the same sort of panel detailing with the rivets are also very sharp and visible down to the bottom. Over here just below the seat, there's also a nice bit of honeycomb pattern. Now we come to the front of the flight pod, and over here we have the controls portion. Once again also cast in a light gray plastic with dark gray for a couple of panel details. This swings down to reveal the inside of the control handle with red paint over here, and this also looks like one of those retro video games targeting system in the red paint. There are also sharp interior details, paneling and rivets all clearly seen and sculpted on, red, black and yellow paint applications over here for a couple of controls, and these paint applications do pop against the light gray. The seat is a black plastic, looks kinda comfy, a little bit like a gaming chair. And once more we see red, green and black paints over here. The black paint over here looks like it leads to an air duct, while I'm also quite impressed with the applications for green paint. Over here this looks like radar, and you can clearly see the numbers 70 and 30 over here. So that's really nice work. Overall, Hasbro has given this vehicle a nice bit of interior detail. And finally you see the red seatbelt over here that keeps the rider in place. And not forgetting the clear glossy plastic canopy on the top of the Trubble bubble. This one has red paint over here for the heads-up display. Really sharp, but it does look a little off-center on my copy. In terms of articulation of cars, the top of the bubble does have a hinge and swings down, and this closes and clips quite firmly into place. You can also swing up the steering controls. This one also swivels 360. You have that ball-jointed cannon on the bottom of the flight pod, and this gives you up and down as well as swivel sideways. And finally, of course, we do have those thrusters that do have the articulated fins. Now we move on to the TeleViper accessories, and he's got a backpack that is cast in a black plastic, purple paint for a couple of buttons on the top, and there's interesting detail like the antenna down the side as well as a couple of ribs down the bottom. He does come with a black plastic hose, and one end of this hose plugs to the bottom of this backpack. And next up he does come with a sort of communications jamming gun. This one is shaped very much like a rifle with a skeletal buttstock on the back, a handle on the top, and a huge barrel on the front. This rifle also has a peg over here, and that pegs into that port on the hose. Before we plug the backpack onto the TeleViper, I also just want to point out something, which is that this backpack is actually cast in two separate halves. So the middle is hollow, and that means that the backpack would be lighter, and of course Hasbro saved some money on the plastic. The backpack plugs into the hole on his back, and of course the lighter backpack also doesn't mess with the balance of the figure. Of course he holds his scanning gun just fine in his hands. The gun also has a hole in its nozzle so you can plug in some effect parts like so. And finally that square hole in the trigger area pegs into this square peg onto the side of the backpack, so the TeleViper can go hands-free I do like all three head sculpts that come with the TeleViper very much. They're all cast in a dark blue plastic, and there's dark gray paint for the communications headset that he's put on. This headset extends from his chin all the way up to the top of his head, looking quite high-tech and showing how he's a master of the telecommunication waves. There's also a hit of purple paint down the side of all these headsets that once again also does really pop on the head sculpts. For the two head sculpts with the flesh tone paints, the default one comes with a lighter complexion, and there's an alternate one that comes with a darker skin tone that's more like African American. The visors on these two head sculpts are also a nice finish with that shiny silver paint that really reflects the light quite well. Both these head sculpts have a sinister sneer, and I do like how there's the digital dot matrix printing for sharp applications on the colors of their lips and the whites of their teeth. For the other head sculpt where it's completely covered up, there's a larger black mouthpiece that sits below a bigger black visor as well, with 4 dots of red paint. This one looks really evil cool, using that headset to scan in different wavelengths. Now to the back of those heads, the one that's fully covered up has an additional electronic device on the back. So there's a nice bit of variation between the head sculpts. The African American head sculpt pops on just fine, so that's a nice bit of representation and diversity in the army building. The completely covered up helmeted head sculpt also looks very cool, because now on the figure, you don't see any of the exposed skin. That also adds a bit of sinister mystery to this figure. And now we have a look at the TeleViper's sculpt and paint. Most of his body is reused from Recondo, but you can't really tell because of the vastly different color palette, as well as the really expressive and unique head sculpts. His torso all the way down to his legs are reused from Recondo, while we have a couple of new parts in his arms, as well as the vest and belt overlays. What also strikes me is that there's no flash tone paint on any part of his body, which is a departure from the classic TeleViper design. Instead, where you think you see some of his exposed skin, like on his arms, as well as his chest area just below the collar, is just black, looking like he's wearing a layer of thermals. But I can understand why Hasbro has done that, presumably to make it easier to swap out those head sculpts for the different ethnicities without having to revamp any of that flash tone paint on the rest of his body. Let's just have a closer look at those details on his body. The torso is cast in a dark blue plastic, and like I mentioned, black paint for the inside. Over here, looking like he's wearing a couple of thermals underneath. Purple vest and belt with sculpted and painted details, like the straps and the pockets. The dark gray paint is present on a couple of panels and buckles down the front, as well as the front of the belt. Down the sides of his arms, the shoulder is cast in a dark blue plastic, very sharp Cobra logo over here. And the rest of his arm is cast in a black plastic. Blue paint for the top of his short sleeve, with also a pocket over here. Pins concealed at the elbow, and we have a purple plastic watch with blue paint for the front of the watch and black for the face. I do also like the detail and paint on his hands. It is cast in a black plastic, and there is also a couple of knuckle guards and purple paint for that little plate on the back of the hand. We go down to the back of the figure and we see the same dark gray paint applied to the purple vest and belt. So I do appreciate that the back of the figure is also painted. On his right forearm, he's got a different accessory. This right gauntlet over here is cast in a purple plastic with blue paint once again for those panels, and very sharply applied black and red paint for the indicator display over here. We move on to his lower body, and it's mostly that dark blue plastic with no paint. We see the same sort of pocket detail and the fabric texture in his pants as we see on Recondo. And finally down to his boots. Purple plastic for the top with black paint for straps, while his foot is a black plastic with purple paint on the top of his boot. And this whole purple and black color scheme for his boots really reminds me of the wrestler The Undertaker. So overall, as I mentioned, there's a lot of reuse in his body, but it's really not apparent because of his distinct purples, blacks, dark grays, and blues. So overall, I do like this modern interpretation of the TeleViper. For articulation, he's got 2 ball joints, one at the top of his neck and one at the bottom, so you can spin his head 360, while those 2 ball joints combine together to give you some decent sideways tilting and also some pretty good range looking down And this is where his headset starts to interfere with his collared shirt, and also decent range looking upwards. He's got butterfly joints at his shoulders, so they do come forward just that much and backward that little bit. Swivel hinge at the shoulders for 360 swivel, and coming out decently far beyond 90 degrees, upper bicep swivel for 360 spin. Double hinged elbows for decent range beyond 90 degrees, and those pins are also concealed. Swivel hinge at the wrist for 360 spin and swinging in and out, which is a bit strange because both hands have those trigger fingers. And I would really expect at least one of those hands to be hinging up and down instead. He's got a mid-torso hinge, and this is concealed below his vest, which also limits that range in the hinge. While also, he's got a ball-jointed waist. Now combining the hinge as well as the ball-jointed waist, you can get about that much of forward bend, mostly due to the constraints of the vest, and then some backward bend about that much. The ball joint at the waist also lets you spin him 360 with that little sideways wiggle. He's got drop down ball joints at the hips that do drop down that far and go pretty decent for a split. Also, very good range forward and backward. There's an upper thigh swivel for 360 spin and double hinged at the knees with those pins concealed as well. Very good range. Swivel just above the boot, and I do want to point out that this boot swivel was quite stuck on mine on both sides, so you might want to heat and pop them to get them into the right bit of range of movement. He also has ankle tilt that goes up that much. It's quite stiff, and then it goes down. And I also do notice now that the ankle hinge is a black plastic, but it's painted in purple, so Hasbro can actually apply paint to the insides of joints. But we do not see that often enough. And finally, he's got ankle pivot that goes outwards and inwards. And just as I spoke about those painted joints, the paint just really flicks off easily, so it might as well not be there. And now we're gonna fit the TeleViper into the flight pod. I also do want to point out that this cannon over here acts as a stabilizing point, so the flight pod sits really stable on the table. And as you have the steering controls lowered to place the figure into the flight pod, the ball joint on the cannon allows the cannon to sit flat on the table and give you the allowance to fit the figure into the flight pod. Now because of the seat size and the length of the red harness, the TeleViper and probably all other figures that you want to fit in will have to have their backpacks removed first. So you seat the TeleViper in the flight pod, pulling his harness down and buckling him up. Get him to grip those control handles tightly, and finally lowering that clear canopy over the rider, and this looks really cool. The colors of the TeleViper really look very nice against the duller light grays and blacks of the Trubble bubble. He looks really fantastic sitting inside this piece of hardware. The fact that he's sitting in the seat with his legs dangling out there just like that really calls back to the Cobra approach to technology, where it's really dangerous and sinister, but also lacks that element of safety for the user. This is really one of the iconic vehicles for the Cobra, and I just love the way it looks. Even kind of hilariously looking, a little like a needlessly high-tech and dangerous toilet. And trying out other figures in the flight pod, of course, here we have Baroness. No problems fitting in a bulkier character like Destro. And you can see over here that the red harness also goes nicely around his large expressive collar. I also like how Destro's colors also really complement the color scheme of the flight pod. And for characters with a slimmer backpack like the Cobra officer, who's got a backpack that only fits one rifle, you can just about squeeze him into that red harness with his backpack on. And he looks really great in the flight pod as well. For size, the TeleViper stands at just over 6¼ inches, and that's about 16 centimeters. While the flight pod stands at almost 6 inches to the top of the canopy, and that's about 15 centimeters. And it's about 5 inches wide if you include the fins on the rockets on the sides. And it's about 7¾ inches from the tip of the cannon to the back end of those fins. on the thrusters, and that's almost 20 centimeters. And of course we gotta do some comparisons with other vehicles. So here he is with the G.I. Joe Ram Cycle. And here he is compared beside the Cobra coil. And I think that the Trubble bubble really looks quite small and cute compared to these other vehicles. And of course here he is with Serpentor's chariot. And you can see how much he's being dwarfed by this really huge and grand golden flying Cobra hovercraft. It's in a much more compact envelope, like 2 flight pods could be the wingman for Serpentor's golden chariot over here. And here he is compared with vehicles from other lines like Marvel Legends. Here we have Hawkeye on his Sky Cycle. For size comparisons, here's the TeleViper with a couple of Cobra leaders, with a couple of Cobra troop builders, and here he is with some G.I. Joes. Here he is with some Marvel Legends and Star Wars Black Series. This is a fantastic release for the iconic Cobra hovercraft flight pod. The vehicle is well sculpted and painted, and there are plenty of interesting features on it, like the thrusters with articulated fins. The TeleViper figure itself is also no slouch, with impressive and varied head sculpts and sharp paints on an eye-catching color scheme. Overall, I am quite pleased with this set, and I can give you a recommendation to get this one. Please like and share this video, let me know what you think in the comments below, subscribe to my channel, or even hit the super thanks button. Thanks for watching, take care, and stay safe.